One.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Cebu's panel about the benefits of a career in business journalism. I'm Nick Sullivan, a journalism student at the University of South Carolina, and this event was organized by Cebu's Educators Committee, which is faculty from several journalism programs throughout the country. And today we will be talking with recent graduates of a few of those programs who will discuss how they've navigated their careers so far and offer advice for those who might be interested in a similar path. So our panelists today are Danielle Abril, a tech reporter for Fortune magazine and a 2008 graduate of Southern Methodist University. We have Ben Winck, an economics reporter at Insider and a 2019 graduate of Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University, and Liz Young, a reporter at New York Business Journal and 2015 graduate of The Ohio State University. Danielle, Ben, and Liz, thank you for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Thank you.
And for today's panel, we will start with an opportunity for each of you to introduce yourselves and tell us about your career so far, how you got there. And following that, we have a series of questions that will be unique to each one of you. And once in a while, I'll throw in a quick question and ask you to give a brief 60-second or less response to each question. So with that being said, we are good to go ahead and get started. So for our introductions, everyone go ahead and give us a brief rundown of your career so far, what you did in college, and kind of how you got to where you are today.
Do you want any?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we can start out with Danielle. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, thanks. I appreciate the introduction. As mentioned, I'm Danielle Abril. I'm a tech writer at Fortune in San Francisco. But I actually started in Dallas, where I went to school. Surprisingly enough, the goal was not to be a journalist. I had assumed I was going to be a lawyer. And at SMU, they didn't allow pre-law. So I took journalism as an avenue because poli-sci apparently is too competitive to get into law school. So I thought journalism was a great route to just do that to get into law school. And then, of course, I fell in love, and the parents weren't too happy with that. But I said, I graduated in 2008 during the recession, which was like the worst time. So I said, let me see if I can get a job. And if I can get a job in a recession, then maybe this is something I should do. And the parents were like, okay, but if you can't, you got to figure it out. And luckily I got a really, really low paying job. And I was living out of my parents' living room. Literally in their dining room. I had converted that into a bedroom, and then stayed there for a little while. It was a niche publication that I won't even mention because it's not really well known. Ended up from there going to the Dallas Morning News and working there for a little while. And then after that, I ended up at the Dallas Business Journal, which is the American City Business Journal's group of business journalism publications. And then after that, I went to the City magazine, which is D magazine, but they had a business publication. So I went to DCEO. And then luckily, I was a tech reporter throughout that and ended up at Fortune. So lots of details in there, but I'm trying to give you the Cliffs Notes or Sparks Notes or whatever you use version. And that's how I'm here now.
Yeah, next we'll go ahead and throw it over to Liz.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to talking to you all. So like Nick said, I'm Liz Young. I am a reporter at the New York Business Journal. I have been with American City Business Journals for the past 6 years. New York Business Journal is one of our publications. Danielle just mentioned us as well. American City Business Journals is a national company. We have publications in 44 cities across the country. We are business news for business professionals. So we're very niche publications. A lot of our markets have a weekly edition, daily digital content, the whole 9 yards. So I started my career at the Albany Business Review, another one of our publications, after college in 2015, and started as the news editor. So I did the digital portion, editing stories, putting them online, social media, all of that good stuff. And then moved over to a reporting role after a few years, covered New York state government and healthcare. And then I relocated down to New York City, just over a year ago. Perfect timing for the COVID-19 pandemic to hit. And now I cover commercial real estate and economic development. So prior to my 6 years at this company, I graduated from Ohio State University, where I studied journalism and economics. And I was on the student newspaper staff for about 3 years there, including when I was a senior, being the editor-in-chief of the Lantern. So that's kind of my story of how I got to where I am.
And last we have Ben.
Hey everyone, really good to be here and great to meet you all. So I guess, I knew at the tail end of high school that I wanted to write. I knew that's what I enjoyed and was decently good at compared to math, science, all the rest of the stuff. So I started, I applied to journalism school, started that at Northwestern, and didn't really know what I wanted to write about. I was a huge car geek, but automotive journalism wasn't really a path to go down. So I started seeing what else was I really interested in. I wrote for the Daily Northwestern, which was our student newspaper, covered stuff in Evanston, the college town, just north of Chicago, and sort of just tried to cover as many different kind of things as possible, both through the student newspaper and then through classes, and just try to find what I really enjoyed, what really wasn't my forte. So throughout college, that's kind of what kept me writing. I had internships at Crane Chicago Business. So that was a cool way to sort of dive into that city-specific business coverage. And then I also had an internship at Bloomberg News in Washington, D.C., where I am right now. And that was, going into that, I didn't really know much about covering government policy, that sort of thing, and learned a lot. I was on the breaking news desk. So again, just trying to, just bouncing around, trying different beats out. And then throughout college, I figured I was really into markets and investing and trying to decode all of that. And so I started off at markets, right after graduating, moved to New York, wrote for Markets Insider until about 3 weeks ago. That's, covering earnings, markets trends, everything from, one specific stock bouncing on some press release or some news to, market-wide shifts. And then I started to realize I was really into economic coverage, macroeconomic policy, Fed stuff, big Fed guy. And so Insider really recently just threw together an economy team. And I signed myself up for that. And that's what I'm writing for right now. So, jobs report last week, that was like a big one, infrastructure week, all that. So definitely more macro scale, but still trying to keep it understandable and relatable down to, what does this mean for your finances, for your small business, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, awesome. And now that we know a little bit about all of your backgrounds, we'll go ahead and do our first quick question. So again, that's 60 seconds or so for each of you. So what social media platform do you find most useful for your job and why? We'll start with Danielle.
I actually would say 2, depending on what your purpose is. So for stories and sort of looking for ideas and sort of getting the pulse on things, I'm always on Twitter. It's super helpful, and you can ask the public things and you can find people you wouldn't find. I have asked for sources like DoorDashers. I need somebody who works for DoorDash. Somebody will call me, things like that. But for also outreach, actually similarly, but slightly different, I would say LinkedIn as well. Their search capabilities allow you to find people who used to work at a company that you cover, who may have some insider knowledge, but those 2 for me are key.
That's
For me as
interesting.
well, for me, LinkedIn is absolutely number one, the one that I use the most, and that's the most helpful. And that's both for engagement on my posts. So it's a great way to share my work and have sources who I've connected with see what it is I'm working on, which is a great way for them to understand, okay, this is what she covers. This is the kind of stuff she's interested in. It's a good way for me to kind of flesh out like maybe some details about the story, that I have the space on LinkedIn to share that beyond the headline. So that's always been great. and people can kind of comment. And then, the way that the algorithm works, I find that it can sometimes get a lot of reach and get in front of people who are connected to my connections, and I can meet new people that way. And that's then the second part of what it's so great for, is that networking component, that you can connect with new sources. You can find people who work for companies that you're interested in. You can connect with people who, let's say, like for me in commercial real estate, I'll connect with brokers and say, hey, can we talk for 30 minutes sometime soon? Basically do a virtual coffee meeting right now, in normal times, a normal coffee meeting, to talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the market. And that helps me with source development, to just get connected with these people in new and different ways. And I think, jumping off what Danielle said, the premium feature is great. And that's something for everyone watching too to be aware of, is that LinkedIn offers that premium feature for free for journalists. So that's a great option to look up online. If you do, I think it's a twice annual training. And it's a very helpful training. If you do that, you get it for free. So it makes it a really must-have resource for reporters.
I'll echo, for me, Twitter is number one, just for everything from breaking news updates. Setting up a tweet deck kind of layout can be super helpful. And just the speed at which, sometimes it's faster to get through that than any media outlets front page. So for me, for that side of it, but also sometimes, at least for what I cover, you can get into some really interesting debates around, inflation, stimulus, whatever the hot topic is. Sometimes you have some pretty relevant and influential names kind of hashing it out on Twitter. And so it can really be as simple as DMing someone, or tweeting at them, seeing if they're willing to speak. I've talked to sources just by doing outreach that way. It's a bit simple or crude, but it's worked, and I think people can discount that sometimes. And then also just for sharing stuff in a way that forces me to keep my stories simple. People might not care about existing home sales for a particular month, but I have this word limit, and I know that a lot of my followers are friends. They're people who might follow me for news, but also friends of mine who might not be covering or following this at all. So yeah, Twitter. And then I'd also, if you want to, for me, I like to sort of get an everyman's view of my beat from time to time, and Reddit can actually be pretty helpful for that. Certain subreddits for, I think it's r/unemployment, for covering the labor market, just kind of not for finding sources or really any particular quotes, but just kind of stepping back and realizing, okay, what are people who are actually living through certain things, or people who aren't writing what I'm writing, what are they feeling, what's it like for them, just so that I'm not just in my own little cocoon of coverage.
Thank you all. That was very insightful. And I think LinkedIn isn't something that necessarily comes to people's mind immediately, but I guess if you're a journalist, definitely look into getting a LinkedIn profile. And now we'll go ahead and do our next question, directed specifically towards Danielle. So how do you come up with a story idea, and how do you know which ones of your ideas are worth covering?
That's a great question. I think that's a question that every journalist constantly asks themselves over time, especially if you switch jobs or you go to different publications. So a story idea can really come from anywhere. It can come from a question that you have that you can't seem to find the answer to. It can come from, like I said, sometimes I just watch Twitter and I watch what people are talking about, and some interesting angles might just come from a discussion or debate. It can come from actual news, right? News breaks, a company releases something new that you need to track, or a big data breach happens and you need to cover it. And it can come also from the sources, the networks that you've built up, right? So over time, you have your network, you regularly call them or check in with them. What's going on? Have you heard anything? Sometimes they'll hit you up unexpectedly and just say, hey, you should be paying attention to this. So that's how you find a story. So I really say, like, it really can come from like just a spectrum of different angles. And then how I determine whether that story is relevant, it really depends on who I'm working for. So like at the DBJ, at the American City Business Journals, that's very different from who I now write for Fortune, which is a much broader, less focused on business people and just like a soccer mom should be able to read Fortune. Whereas Dallas Business Journal, I think we were more focused on the people who were in that business or in that industry, like working for the people in the business. So you really have to think about your audience. And I could say the same about all the other publications. Like you really have to think about like, what does my audience care about? So at Fortune, if there's some tiny little market thing that's very niche-y, at a tech publication, that may be big news. At Fortune, it's like, does Sally soccer mom care about that? Not to say that Fortune only cares about soccer moms, but like, is it broad enough to hit such a wide ranging audience? Will my friends who are not tech journalists or tech insiders care? If they don't, it's probably not a Fortune story. It needs to be business centered, but broad enough for a broad audience. So I just think that you always have to be thinking about who your reader is.
And was it hard at all to navigate different audiences when you changed jobs?
I think it's definitely a mind switch that takes time because you naturally want to go back to what you've been doing for years and you're like, oh, this is a story. And then it's usually your editor who's like, yeah, maybe not for this publication. So it does take some time, but it does become initially sort of a conscious effort of like, who is my audience and do they care? And sometimes even things that I think are cool, I'm like, okay, but does my audience care? And I do have to do like a temperature check. I care, but does my audience care? But it's just something you get used to over time. And if you regularly ask yourself that, you sort of get into the swing of knowing what is a story and what isn't.
Yeah. And next up for Liz, why do you think business journalism is something that students should consider as a career path?
I think students should look at business journalism because I think it fundamentally is a really exciting part of journalism. I think that you have the opportunity to tell stories about people. So we think business journalism, and you might be thinking like, oh, it's about companies, and oh, it's about, like I studied economics, oh, it's about the economy, and oh, it's about these big picture things. But really it comes down to, again, like all three of us have been talking about, it comes down to what people are experiencing. And like the people who I talk to for my job and my sources are decision makers, and they are people. So I'm writing about the things that are motivating them, the regulations that are impacting them. I'm writing about like tangible things that are happening in their worlds. And that gives us a really unique opportunity too, to tell stories that other people aren't telling, because like Danielle was just talking about, every part of business journalism, any publication you work for will have a more specific audience than maybe like a general news publication might. And so that's really exciting too, because you might have the opportunity to tell stories no one else is telling. And that can be a really cool thing to get to do in a world where it feels like a lot of us are covering the same thing day in and day out. If you're looking at Twitter and you're getting news alerts on your phone from some of the major news outlets. So I think that's really one of the reasons students should look into it. I think the other thing is a lot of business journalism these days has moved to a subscription base. And I know at least at ACBJ, that's been really successful for us. And one of the things that's really great about that is not only does that mean that we have a really engaged audience, but it means that it's a growing career path. So right now across the country, we're hiring reporters, which is very exciting. And that means that there's a lot of opportunities for young students who are looking for, where can I get a job? I want to move somewhere exciting. I want a beat that I can really dive into. There's a lot to look into.
And I know finding a job is always at the forefront of any student's mind. So that's good to hear. And for Ben, how has the pandemic changed how you do your job? And is that any sort of change that you see sticking around long term?
Yeah, so I think the immediate impact is obviously, I mean, what we're doing right now, right? This might have been an in-person thing, a year ago or a little bit more than that now. But just getting acclimated to this sense of at first it seems like it's so much harder to organize these things, right? But actually now I feel that we've been doing this for so long, and I realized this pretty early on too. So many more panels, so many more live streams, video conferences, press conferences, that sort of thing. So many of them are now much more accessible than they were before all of this, right? And so I'm able to tune into a lot more, listen to some really interesting people speak and cover those live, and not have to leave my room, which, sure, I do kind of miss the office for many reasons, but I think that's allowed for a lot of flexibility. And I think some of that will definitely stick around because having a bit more transparency and opening these things up to more people, I don't think anybody's arguing against that. And I think if it allows you to have more, interesting people at a panel, right? If opening it up to doing it on Zoom or Google Meets or whatever, lets you have a more interesting set of panelists for, maybe an economics conference or whatever, and lets you open it up to more viewers, it's a win-win. And so for me, that's been one example. And then also for, just one-on-one chats with sources. I think for one, it's a bit easier because there's less logistics involved. And oddly enough, I found it's a bit more humanizing. When I'm talking to a source and I can hear their dog barking in the background or a kid crying, we can both just kind of like, this has happened many times. We both just kind of chuckle and like, we're all going through this, and economics guru who I've looked up to forever. There's just a person too. And I think that comes out more in this environment than if we were to meet at a Starbucks or something.
Do you feel like there have been instances where you've noticed that really helped your reporting, where you have those kind of elements, like you mentioned the dog barking or like the child in the background?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think it turns it from an interview to a conversation. And for me, that's been really helpful, especially as I've pivoted from markets to economy coverage. If there are things that I'm not super familiar with, or I want some clarification, it's a lot easier for me to ask, hey, I explain this to me as if I just started, because I kind of just have on this new team. How do you see this? Or am I correct in saying this or in presuming this? I think it's a lot easier to have that kind of conversation, to be that casual when you do break down that initial barrier, right? When you do realize, okay, sure, this is an interview, sure, this is on the record and I'm asking questions, but also it can be a bit looser and we can just kind of chat in between the more interviewee bits.
Yeah. And next, we'll go ahead and we'll move on to our next quick question. So again, that's 60 seconds, everybody gets to answer. What do you like most or what do you like least about your job and why? And we'll start with Danielle.
Let's see. What do I like most is probably just like, I feel like I'm a professional student, which is the reason why I fell in love with journalism. Is I basically get paid to learn a bunch of stuff that I didn't know and to play an important role in explaining that to other people and empowering them to have that knowledge. And in my early days, it started as something simple as like, what Ben was talking about sort of on the policy side, or like local politics, things like that. But now I'm talking about like Facebook breaches and things that like we care about, like, oh, do I want to delete Facebook? I don't know. And so, and those are very relevant, or, whether we, should break up Google, or, these are very big societal questions, and questions that I don't know I would have had the chance to really dive into if I wasn't a journalist, and definitely wouldn't get paid to learn about. So that's probably my favorite thing. My least favorite thing is probably in line with that, is like, you never know what you're going to do. You can kind of plan out your weeks or months, but it never really goes according to that, because there's always some kind of like hiccup or breaking news, or you have to be here, you have to be there. So it's really a lesson in flexibility. And I think that's with any journalism, but in business journalism, it's really weird when all of a sudden at like 5 o'clock on a Friday, like something breaks. Like, are you kidding me? Like, I'm a business journalist. That's not supposed to happen. but it does. And so it's definitely a pro and a con, I would say.
I would say, similar to Danielle, my favorite part about my job is getting to tell stories of people who, their stories aren't necessarily being told in other formats. So getting to learn about things that they're going through that I wouldn't necessarily know otherwise, and then get their stories out in front of other people. You know, sometimes the real world implications of that can be great and huge. So telling, you know, how a state government regulation impacts a small business owner, or telling, you know, what the effects of local development policy will have on a project, that can be really impactful. So that is really exciting and a lot of fun. I think the least favorite part of what I do is kind of, there's like a pre-pandemic, it was transcribing. But now during the pandemic, I do a lot more phone calls, so I can kind of like transcribe while I'm on the phone. But then during the pandemic, I think in its place, like Ben said, there's upsides to doing these calls on Zoom instead, but I still really miss the connection that you're able to make with people in person. And so I'll be excited to go back to that in the months ahead, just to be able to sit down with people and have more of those face-to-face connections where you can kind of just, I think it's easier for them to remember you and to connect with you, and to build that long-term relationship when you're able to sit down face-to-face at least every once in a while. So I think that will be something nice to go back to.
I think for me, it's similar, but I'm going to throw a bit of a skew on it. You know, we're learning these things as we go. Someone told me once that journalism is an industry where you have to become an expert on things faster than anybody else. And I think, you know, that can be stressful, sure, but that's also really fun. And I think taking some of these more complex topics and explaining, okay, but what does this mean for literally anybody reading the story? I geek out on economic data releases. That is my bread and butter. I love it. But I can totally see why, you know, the average person just wouldn't care how many non-farm payrolls were added in March. Taking a number or a set of numbers and explaining, you know, here's the narrative behind it. Here's what this means, especially right now, you know, with so many people watching, you know, how are we going to recover from this? And what is the economy going to look like? What is life going to look like after all this? Explaining, you know, here's the number, sure, here's what it means, and here's what we can infer from it. To me, making that translation is really, really fun, and it's what keeps me really engaged in this coverage. My least favorite, you know, sometimes, this happened to me last week, you know, sometimes you just have those weeks where nobody will get back to you. You badly need some sources, and for whatever reason, everyone decided that it's, you know, don't email Ben back day. And that can be, you know, the stress that goes along with that. I mean, that is just, you know, for all kinds of journalists, but sometimes, you know, that's just how it is. And I think, you know, sure, you learn to take a bit more time and reach out to people a little earlier, but sometimes you do have to lean on others, and it can be a little bit stressful.
Yeah, and the next question actually is for you, Ben. And reading your stories, I kind of noticed that there's a distinct voice to them. Like, you can tell that this was Ben Winck's story. So do you have any tips on how young journalists can develop their own voice in their reporting?
Thanks, man. And that's a really good question. I think, first off, you're going to want to have a voice. You're going to want to, you know, like your favorite reporters you read, you know, growing up and as you learn. I think you really have to be patient, because that is not something that happens just like that. And a lot of it is just talking with your editor. A lot of that has to do with who you're writing for and what you're covering, who your audience is. That shapes your voice, and your voice will change depending on who you're writing for and what you're covering. But I think in terms of developing your voice, for me, and for what I cover, and this idea of wanting to demystify some of these, just what's going on in the economy, I try to think of, you know, where was my mind at when I first started reading, you know, a non-farm payroll story, when I first started following this stuff. What did I want to know? And what was I not getting from the stories that I was reading, right? Inverted pyramid is great. And there are ways to, you know, there are certain ways that you just have to do things, but, you know, trying to wrap my head around what I wanted out of stories when I first started reading these things. that can keep that has helped me stay, I think, fresh and keep in mind, if someone is coming to this story for the first time, they've never read anything about the economy ever, how can I make it legible? How can I make this understandable?
Yeah, and the next question is for Danielle, and this is something Ben actually touched on, is sometimes you have days where people just won't respond to you. And I imagine the tech industry can be kind of secretive. So how do you find and develop sources in a beat where people aren't always the most forthcoming and they don't necessarily love talking to the press?
So tech is notorious for this. Knocking on the front door is more of a courtesy than an expectation that you're going to get anything. It's just like, hey, I'm doing this thing. You're really just telling them you're doing it, because I don't ever expect an answer. I'm really surprised when I get an email back. I'm like, oh, they emailed me and it's a sentence. Okay, we're going to, I guess, publish the one sentence. So it is true. It's notorious for this. I would say there's several ways around it. One is, obviously in the pandemic world, it's a little different, but it's usually networking. So in San Francisco, luckily, like all the tech people are like in the Bay Area, not all of them, but a good majority. So you go to different tech events and all of a sudden now you know a VP, or now you just had drinks with somebody at a networking, blah, 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 and you keep their card and you call them up and you say, hey, by the way, what da, 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 da. And they may or may not be able to help you on the record, but most of the time they're willing to help you off the record. And that can lead you down new avenues. So networking is one thing, which is a little bit more challenging in the pandemic. Expert sources. I always have a list of analysts and academics that can really help me sort of digest some of the things, like why is this particular element important to the larger conversation? And they can say, well, because historically this thing happened or whatever. And all of a sudden you have now the bigger picture story rather than this one thing happened. And you can really tell a full story. So experts. And then the other piece I would say is actually the thing we were talking about earlier with social media, which is either it's the outside people that you're like crowdsourcing, or going to like former employees. Honestly, former employees are some of the best sources because they have most of the time they have no skin in the game. In tech, sometimes they have equity, and so it's a little bit more complex. But if they don't have skin in the game, they're like, yeah, let me tell you what was happening. And it's really helpful, especially if they were really annoyed and they left annoyed, and then they'll be like, I'll tell you all the secrets because they shouldn't be doing this or whatever. But if you really sort of press on all those different channels, you may not get every one of them to respond, but something will pop up across that board. So even if you can't get knocking on the front door, you can still write a story using one of those other channels.
Yeah, so there's always an avenue in your experience that you can find your way into the story.
Oh, absolutely. Some avenues are better. It's the employees are always the best avenue, but if you can't get that, maybe you can get, an expert source, or maybe you can get somebody who tangentially knows something because they were a vendor or whatever. So there are always ways in.
And then for Liz, I know one concern for young journalists is often, when I get my first job, it'll probably be somewhere I don't live, on a topic that I don't really know anything about. So what did you do to become knowledgeable about real estate and the region that you cover?
I think this is a great question. And I think this is so much of like what we live as journalists, that I think whether you're young, middle of your career, or very, very experienced, like everybody goes through this constantly, because you can move or get a new beat at any time. I mean, Ben was just talking about it. He just got a new beat too. So this can happen constantly. And I think one thing to always keep in mind is that your network, you never know how people are going to intersect with each other. So there might be people who you're meeting now in college who are going to be helpful for you, even if you move to a different city and cover something very specific. Like I said, if you're on LinkedIn, especially, you might start to see like, oh, I have this professor who knows this person I'm trying to connect with. Let me ask them like what they know about the person. So you just never know. And so you can kind of always be thinking about like what's going on with your network in that sense. So yeah, when I moved to New York a year ago, I I had never covered commercial real estate before. And I had covered economic development a little bit because of my time covering state government, which encompasses economic development. So when I moved here, commercial real estate, it's a huge part of New York City's economy. It was kind of overwhelming, right? So I was like, what can I do to learn about this? And my solution was a lot of what Danielle just touched on. It was talk to everybody I can about every part of this. So that involved everyone directly involved in the industry. That's everyone from real estate brokers and real estate developers to people who are more tangentially involved. So companies who lease space and lawyers who work with companies leasing space and who work with real estate companies. And just having this kind of big picture view of the way that everyone interacts with the industry that you cover. This is true with state government, with healthcare as well. It's not just true in real estate. That if you keep that big picture view, you'll learn a lot of different things about the industry that you're covering, and you'll make a lot of connections that way. And again, those people can then introduce you to maybe a broker you're having trouble getting a hold of or something down the line. I think the other thing that can be really helpful is that reporters are really easy to get a hold of. So I spent a lot of time talking to other reporters who cover commercial real estate, and that helped me break through what some of the industry jargon is. What are some of the things that they find resonate with their audiences? What are the ways that they like to get stories, and what are some of the best stories that they find? So that helped a lot. And then the other thing was more about the city that you live in. So New York, I was actually more familiar with because I grew up about an hour outside of the city. So when I moved to Albany, I had never been to Albany before. When I moved here, I was a little more familiar with it, but my approach was actually similar to what I did when I moved to Albany, which is to just be constantly curious about the community that you live in. So that's whether you've been to it a million times or whether you're moving there brand new. You should constantly try to be out and about exploring, and that can be driving around, it could be on public transit, it could be walking. Just trying to absorb like what's going on, like, is there a coffee shop opening? Like, are there a lot of retail for lease signs up? Like, just what's happening. And just also like reading a lot about the place where you live. And that's all kinds of coverage. So what are like the cool museum exhibits going on, cool restaurants opening? And these are things that then you can bring up with your sources. And Ben had touched on this earlier, like the humanization part of talking to people on Zoom working from home. That can kind of help even in non-pandemic times to say like, if they find out that you live in a particular neighborhood, they might say, oh, I love the pizza place at X and X. Have you ever been there? And you can say, oh, no, I haven't been there, but I've been to like this other place. And it's just a way for you to connect with people. So I think that being constantly curious about the community that you're in and trying to spend a lot of time learning about it, learning the history of it, learning what people like to do, I think that can be really helpful no matter where you are.
Yeah, and it sounds like one of the keys that I like that you're talking about is even if you're having a conversation with someone who in no way, shape, or form impacts a story that you're working on, that person might one day on a story that you're working on, like years down the line, come into handy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I had somebody once, and sometimes it's not somebody who you can later get a hold of, but everything contributes to this. You build these narratives in your head of being able to kind of like see the forest through the trees of what's happening in your community. So one time I had a guy, a AAA employee, changing a flat tire, and he was telling me about this place that he'd been laid off from. And it played into this larger story that a colleague and I were working on that I'll tell you about later when we talk about big stories that we've worked on. We were working on a big investigative story about upstate economic development projects and how that had taken some of the momentum away from a particular industry in the Albany area. And that was the industry that he had lost his job in. And now he was working for AAA. And so it was like that totally backs up what we've been reporting on. So yeah, it can be anybody.
So just get out there and talk to people, it sounds
Yep.
like. Yeah, and so now we'll just go ahead, we'll do our next round of quick questions. So tell us briefly about your favorite story or one that you're most proud of and why. And we will start with Danielle again.
It's really funny because I'm a tech reporter, but every now and then I get offbeat and do something very random. that's still business, but not tech. And this is just a personal like connection to this story that I have. But when I was at the City magazine, it was during the Trump years. And it was, I think, a year into his presidency. And one of the things that I was very concerned with was the language around immigration and immigrants, and specifically how he was using it in a business sense, like they're a problem for the economy versus anything else. So I took that to the local level and I said, well, let's find some immigrants and like what's really happening. And I ended up finding some successful, basically CEOs and business owners that were like, came to this country illegally, but are now creating hundreds and hundreds of jobs for people within the city of Dallas. And just hearing their stories of, you know, what it was like to have to come and the way they came. Literally one person came in a trunk of a car, and one person remembers crossing the river and almost drowning. And these were stories that you hear that are often vilified, and then to then turn it around and say, but now they employ this many people and this is what they're doing for the local economy, really was able to sort of tell a different story than what we were hearing in the national rhetoric. And while I don't know if it made any like massive change, I like to feel like it added, I like to tell myself that it added to the sentiment towards immigrants at the time, in a city and an area, a state that, you know, has a lot of these issues. So that's just something that just personally resonates with me. It's probably not my most like biggest story I've ever done, but it just felt the closest to home.
Yeah, and did you pitch that story or were you assigned? Because I know you mentioned it was offbeat.
Yeah, no, I totally pitched it. So I was the managing editor at the time at DCEO. So I did tech journalism and managing editor, but we had a special issue that we dedicated to Latino heritage. And I was trying to think of like, you know, just Latino stories that we could do. And I was like, this isn't really a tech story. Can I still do it? And my editor was like, yeah, that sounds great. Go ahead. And yeah, it was something that I had just spent some time thinking a lot about. And again, had the question, like, what's really happening? And that's how it came to be.
Yeah. Liz, you can go ahead.
That sounds like a fantastic story, Danielle. I'm gonna have to look that up and read that. So the story that I am most proud of was the one that I just touched on a little bit. So I spent a year working with a colleague in Albany, Chelsea Diana, on a deep dive investigation into Governor Andrew Cuomo's upstate New York economic development strategy and how that had stalled the momentum of the nanotechnology industry in the Albany region in particular. And that involved a lot of public records requests, freedom of information law requests, a lot of on the record, off the record interviews, a lot of digging through reports and data. And it took a lot of time, obviously. So I was really appreciative that we were given the time and the opportunity and the space to tell the story the way that we were. And one of the things that made me really proud of it was that when we put it together and when it published, a lot of business leaders in the community said, this is the story that we feel like hasn't been told this way and this completely. And this has been the story of the region that just hasn't been articulated. So we felt really proud that we were able to pull it off and deliver that to them.
I had one answer for this going into this question. I listening to both of you give your answers, a different one came to mind. I was pretty young back in, I don't remember too much of the financial crisis, but obviously, reporting on what's going on right now, parallels are drawn. A story that I wrote, it was a co-byline with a colleague of mine who covers economic policy. By the way, co-bylines are fantastic. Being able to work with someone who's an expert in something that really adds to this story, but I just don't understand too much of, highly recommend. But about how the lack of state and local government relief back in 2008, 2009 held back the economic recovery that happened thereafter. It really just started as something I saw in a research note from one of the major banks. And I talked with my editor, talked with this other reporter who I worked with on this story, and turned into this big feature that came out in early December, before Biden was even in office. And obviously he did not maybe he read the story, but it's not the reason why that was in the latest stimulus bill. But I think being ahead of the curve, thinking of what might he target, where what mistakes were made last time we were in a similar sort of situation, and how could we learn from that? What specifically, why is state and local government aid important? What can it do to help or hinder a recession and the following recovery? So taking that and explaining, oh well, it's so that governments can rehire workers like public school teachers, and not having that relief leaves states in a pretty big hole because they can't borrow money the same way the federal government can. I mean, it gets pretty in the weeds, but I think researching that, talking with sources, even though I wasn't a reporter back in 2008, 2009, being able to write about that and learn along the way, like we've been talking about, it's really fun. It's what keeps me so interested in this job and this coverage. And I think it made for a really, really interesting story.
And this next question is going to be for Danielle. We're going to go back to talking about jobs a little bit. Is there anything specific that you think people should look for in companies when we are applying for jobs?
Absolutely. I always say when you're interviewing for a job, you're interviewing them, they're not interviewing you. Because you have to always look for the things that you care about. And for me, it's like a principles aligns issue. Like I've left jobs where my principles didn't align, or, it wasn't going a direction I felt was good. So I always think that when you're interviewing, one of the things that I always suggest that people do is try to find people who left, and talk to them, because now when I say left, I mean left, not fired, because that's a different situation. But when you find people who left, just like former employees, like I said in reporting, they'll tell you the full picture. They have no skin in the game. They loved it, and maybe they got a new opportunity, so they just left because they're getting a better opportunity somewhere else. Or there was some problems and I just didn't see it getting resolved, and this is the issues that I had, and then you can decide, like, are those deal breakers for me? So I can't tell you specifically what to look for other than the obvious, like make sure the company is like financially stable. But as a business journalist, you do that anyways, like as you're reporting. So make sure like they have, what are your sources of revenue? How are those sources doing? What is your company culture? That's important. But a lot of those things, like I said, you're going to get one picture from the company, just like you do when you're reporting, and you're going to get a different picture from the employees who left, because they'll be able to say, well, yes, all that's true, but here are the other things too. So, I would just think about what's really important to you as a professional, both in your career growth and trajectory, and also just like as a person, like what do you care about? And then try to get from the company, do those things align? And then ask people who left if they really do align. I'm so sorry. As we had previously mentioned, Ben, this is a very humanizing moment. But yeah, those are the things that I would suggest to people who are job hunting.
So it sounds like LinkedIn once again coming in handy.
Yes, LinkedIn and Twitter, because reporters, believe it or not, reporters are all over Twitter. So, and oftentimes even in their Twitter bio, it like mine says, Danielle, Fortune writer, previously at XYZ. And so like you can literally find people who previously worked at the company that you're applying for.
And for Ben, after reporting on a complex topic for so many years, how do you make sure that your stories are still accessible and make sense to the average reader?
Yeah, so that's kind of gets at the crux of covering, especially just business journalism in general, but also covering when you get into more complex topics. And I know I said earlier, trying to keep in mind, where my head was at when I first started covering this stuff, when I first started learning about this stuff. But really, it can be just as simple as literally asking an average reader, a friend of yours, your family, send them your stories. If it's something that, you can send to them, draft of, that's not, it doesn't have some secret information or anything that's embargoed. Send parts of that. For me, it really is that simple, and that's been hugely helpful. In terms of just, I can get really wonky now. Like I want to dive into some stuff that can get really complex, or just the language just gets inaccessible, and you need to have a control, right? You need to have someone who can say, okay, I lost you here, or what did you mean by this? That can be an editor for sure, but my editor is, he and I get super wonky together. Sometimes he might not catch those things. And that's just the nature of the job, right? So I think having some trusted friends, family, mentors, other reporters, just not those who are on your beat specifically, for feedback, and just to kind of check on what is understandable, where is it working, and what might not be working. It sounds really simple, but that really just kind of gets at the heart of keeping these things understandable and making the stories effective.
Yeah, and for Liz, business reporting can be pretty numbers heavy, dealing with a lot of finances and just numbers across the board. So what tips do you have for crafting a story using numbers that is still easy for a reader to digest?
So I think Ben touched on this earlier. I think it's about, you use interviews and you talk to people. So if you get a report, you go to your sources, or you even just call the person who wrote the report as a good starting point. So like when you're fresh out of school and maybe you don't have sources in the industry yet, a great starting point is call the people who wrote the report. They'll tell you about the report, and you'll get some great quotes, and you'll learn a little bit more of, like, you can ask them questions like, what is it that stands out to you about this report? What are the things that, looking forward, you think we should be watching? You can say, like, this number really stuck out to me. Does that stand out to you? And they might surprise you sometimes and say, yeah, I mean, that stands out, but every year leasing drops in January, so that's not that alarming. And so then you have this great context. So then you can put together a story that's much more narrative based, and you can include quotes, and then you use the numbers to back up the points that you're making, and you use the numbers as kind of a supplement, and that makes it a lot easier for the reader to digest. I also find that, where you're able to embed charts and graphs, so that the people who want to dive in the data a little bit more, they can go in there and do it if they want to, but it's not. And then the people who don't want to dive into it, they can kind of glance over it with their eyes and see, oh yeah, I see what she's saying, leasing really dropped off, or whatever it might be. That's a great way to communicate some of that as well.
Yeah, so we are running a little bit low on time, so we'll just go through another round of quick questions, and if we still have time, we'll do another one after that. But our next question is going to be, what is one piece of advice that has been most useful for you during your career? And we will start with Danielle.
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like I had a great answer for this a while ago, and now my brain is like, there's so many good pieces of advice. But I'd actually say probably a lot of the advice that I learned in J school, believe it or not, is the advice that I carry with me. Because in J school, you're learning like an idealistic view of the way a job should be. Oftentimes that's not the way it works out, but you're able to remember, like, what are the things. For me, my whole career has been driven by what is important to me. And I wouldn't be where I am or doing what I'm doing if I didn't follow that. I wouldn't have moved to certain jobs. I wouldn't have, and there were times when literally people were like, why are you leaving DBJ for, the city magazine like that? Like, why would you do that? But I always listened to, like, in J school, what were the things that I cared about and that my professors always told me would help me grow. And this is one actually that came from a reporter from the Dallas Morning News that came down to me along the same lines, which was never take a job that you're not scared of. If you're not scared of the job, then it's too easy. It's going to be like a lateral move. If you're looking at it and going, I don't know if I can do it, that's the job you take, because that's going to force you to grow. It's going to force you to learn. It's going to force you to do things you never did. And that's where you want to be. That's how you improve. But if you're just always taking comfortable positions, you won't see that kind of growth.
I think building on that, but getting down to just the more granular level, don't open yourself up to story ideas, pitches that scare you. You know, I knew, for example, I knew so little about how Treasury yields, what they meant, how they worked, just the Treasury market in general, right? Google is your friend. Obviously, don't just cite whatever you find on Google, but take time to, you know, research this stuff and talk to people. You know, being honest in that, you know, hey, I am just starting on this topic. I'm just covering this for the first time. Please explain it to me as if, you know, with that in mind. I think that's what makes this challenging, but also so rewarding, is that you can stare at a pitch, you can stare at a feature, or even a shorter story, really doesn't matter. And it can seem like this insurmountable mountain, but give it some time, give it a shot. I think, you know, like you were saying, Danielle, and you know, with jobs, I think that applies to stories, to beats, to collaborations. Just take that dive and trust that you have, you know, you have colleagues, you have editors, you have people you can lean on. But don't stick with what's safe, don't stick with what's boring, because you might also miss out on, you know, the dream beat or a topic that you love covering just because it seems so complex or difficult to understand.
I think another great piece of advice that I've gotten from a few people over the years too is kind of like a time management strategy that you should try to schedule your days so that you have maybe an hour each day, which seems like a lot, but in the scheme of a day isn't that much. But you have an hour each day to work on something a little bit bigger picture. And over time, that can build up to like a story that you're really proud of. So that's the only way that my colleague and I in Albany were able to put together this year-long investigation, was by working on it, like chipping away at it over like 365 days. It would have been like insurmountable otherwise. And if we had waited until the last 2 weeks, we could have never done it. So I think that has been something that I go through ebbs and flows. I'll be honest, like sometimes I'm great about that. And other times, like there's periods of time where it's just too busy and it isn't as much of a priority as it should be. But I think that's something that, you know, if you go into your career thinking like, I'm going to make time for bigger picture stories, I'm going to make time for source development that is solely for the purpose of source development, and not so that every phone call results in a story for that day. Like those are things that will advance your career, will help you get greater stories later on, and just will help you feel more fulfilled too.
Yeah, so I guess we can try one more really quick. We'll call it a super quick question. What is one skill that you wish you'd learned earlier in your career, and why? And this will be our last question.
I guess I'll start. That was similar to, I think, an answer that Ben gave earlier, which was finding your voice. I think but again, that takes time. When you're young, you're so focused on just getting the facts right, which you should always be focused on. But even just the idea of like, what is voice and how do I put it in my stories was not something I thought about until much later in my career. But I wish I had thought about it earlier and started working on it earlier, because I think that does add just a whole new element to your writing.
I would say source development. I wish that coming out of college, even before I was a reporter, even while I was a news editor, that I would have focused more on source development. I think you can be developing sources no matter what your role is in a newsroom. And I think that's something you can work on at any time. It doesn't just have to be for a beat that you're working on. It's helpful when it's a beat because then it has a focus. But I think that's something that everyone should be thinking about just right out of the gate.
This one is pretty specific to a lot of what I cover, but I think you can widen it to a ton of things. Sometimes there are things that are scheduled. It can be earnings reports, it can be press conferences, it can be, for me, it's a lot of econ data releases, but pre-writing can be so helpful. I have a pre-write to do right after this for jobless claims tomorrow. I just love getting my stories up and trying to, as fast as possible, trying to beat competitors, even though we are a much smaller team. But even just kind of getting into what goes into a pre-write, it helps you kind of zoom out and think, okay, what is the context, the narrative, the through line compared to the data from last week, last month, last quarter? And what are some superlatives that put this into context, right? Is it the lowest reading of the pandemic? Is it the most optimistic reading in a decade? Getting those ducks in a row before the data is out makes publishing it so much less stressful because you have so much already. And you go into it knowing, okay, this is the context that's important. This is what's going to make this story relevant and not just a regurgitation of the press release or the data that you got, right when that released.
Yeah, well, thank you all again. I, at least speaking for myself, learned a lot, and this was very insightful. And that unfortunately is all the time that we have, but I believe Tess sent out a link in the chat for everybody to fill out a feedback form. So that's for everybody that's watching. So if you can go ahead and do that, that'd be great. And yeah, that's all we have for today.
Thanks so much for having me. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much. That was a blast.